Okay, and let's talk about the beneficial flora. The amount of bifidobacteria, I'm sorry, next slide, thank you. The amount of bifidobacteria in the HIV positive group was between 25% and 50% of that found in the general population, whereas the levels of lactobacilli were nearly undetectable in the HIV positive subjects. Next slide. Let's skip over this because I'm running a little short on time. Okay, next slide. Okay, why should gay men be especially vulnerable to changes in gut microflora? Well, before I go into it, this is going to include a fairly frank discussion of gay male sexuality. So if anybody is going to be offended by that, you can run screaming from the room now. Okay, next slide. There are three possible reasons. Antibiotic usage to address STDs is conceivably higher in populations that are most sexually active. In his 1996 paper, Causation argued that broad-spectrum antibiotic usage was the culprit. But there are other things that I think need to be considered, things that perhaps someone like Causation wouldn't recognize because he's not a gay man. Next slide. Rectal douching. This is a common practice among gay men in preparation for receptive anal sex, and this directly affects the flora in the colon. Some people have had trouble when I explain this to them grasping the concept that this could be harmful. They think, it's water, what's the problem? Well, look at it this way. Gynecologists routinely tell women not to douche, use vaginal douches because it upsets the flora in the vagina and it makes them more susceptible to infection. Exactly the same thing is happening with men here. Next slide, please. There have been a few studies that address this, not that many, but a couple that I was able to find are pretty notable. A 1985 study concluded that our findings suggest that frequent enemas may predispose to infection and immunodeficiency in some homosexual males. A 2008 study found that douching was a very common practice and was performed by 96% of the HIV-positive gay men in that particular study. Next slide. Something else that needs to be considered are sexual lubricants, many of which are hyperosmolar, which means they cause the skin to dry out. There are not a lot of studies about that either, but one fairly recent one, next slide please, had this to say. It found that many of the commercially available lubricants dried out the lining of the colon. Astroglide, which is the top-selling brand worldwide and one targeted to gay men, was described as highly hyperosmotic and resulted in severe irritation and tissue damage. Think about it this way. If the ecosystem in your gut is a rainforest, rich in species and interdependencies, these activities, antibiotics, rectal douching, and the use of lubricants are the equivalent of loggers coming in and cutting down all the trees. That's what's happening. And these are not uncommon practices among gay men, and they're not isolated. They happen regularly over time. Nobody's ever talked about this before, to my knowledge. Next slide, please. Something else that's not talked about too much either is that there are fairly extreme versions of anal sex, which some subsets of the gay male community participate in. And so along with the more extreme versions of anal sex come more exaggerated versions of what I'm talking about. So this particular group has historically been seen to be most at risk, and I think there are very good reasons for that. Next slide. Championing an awareness of the role of intestinal microflora in health and illness, I think, is a great way for rethinkers to reach gay men in a meaningful way. I don't imagine that these ideas explain everything that's called AIDS among gay men, but I do believe it's an important factor that's been overlooked by rethinkers. It's been my experience that once I explain these concepts to other gay men, they get it. It makes sense to them in a way that other alternative theories haven't. And for some, it's a very powerful, eye-opening awareness. And it's my hope that this furthers the discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony Lance, very,
Thank
very
you.
much. That was really, really interesting, and I know there will be questions.
Okay.
Now, who's got the microphone? You do. Okay. Do you want to take it there and then there?
Hi, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Again, this is not exactly a question, but it's very relevant to what you said. I think my personal case is very relevant to what he's talking about. I have been HIV positive officially since 1988,
Wow.
or over 21 years. I have never used antiretroviral therapy. I have definitely had the experience of having to fight for my position over all these years. But one of the things that I have always felt was that the greatest challenge to my personal health was systemic candidiasis.
Yes.
One of the things that makes my personal experience, I think, anomalous is that a year ago I was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma. So that's 20 years into my history of non-use of antiretroviral therapy. I also never was a popper user. So there are many...
Excuse me, is this a question, please? Please, we must be strict, okay? If you have a question, put it. If not, I have to move on. Okay? Sorry.
It's
You can speak
it's
later.
not a question, but it is an important
I've
supportive...
already
know.
told other people they can't
I
do
understand.
that.
I
Okay.
understand.
There's a question from the floor there.
I hate to criticize the speaker, but you said that you had read Peter Duesberg's book in one sitting. That's a 900-page book. You missed some things. Professor Duesberg covers some of the important issues that you mentioned in your talk today. You have elaborated on them and developed them, and I compliment you as a gay man to confront these issues and popularize them. It's excellent work. But Professor Duesberg mentioned many of the points you made, and so when you brought them up, I said, well, I read that in Professor Duesberg's book, or I read that in another book on the subject.
This isn't a question either. Question, please, over there. Please take the microphone. I'm sorry, no, we have to have questions now. Later is discussion. Yeah, just a moment. There's a question
I've
there.
gone
Peter.
to several talks on the immune system, and it said 70% of the immune systems in your colon
Right.
with the bacteria.
Right.
And I'm wondering, what do you take for that? There's several products you can take to
Yeah.
increase the positive bacteria in your system, and they work.
Yes, exactly. I was pretty lucky early on in 1996 when I tested positive. Again, I happened to come across a book in a health food store that explained a lot of this, the importance of intestinal flora. And it was something that kind of stuck with me. I didn't really think that much about it, but I thought, it can't hurt. So I started drinking probiotic things like kefir and taking probiotic capsules occasionally. I actually began making my own sauerkraut not that long ago, unpasteurized sauerkraut. So I regularly use cultured food products. And I'm pretty convinced that's important to my health, and it possibly explains. That's okay. Kefir, it's a cultured milk product. It's like yogurt, but a step beyond. It has about 10 or 12 different live cultures in it. That's something I use regularly.
Okay, one question.
I fully agree with you.
Thank you.
So that I just want to ask about probiotics bacteria. That's one problem because we use probiotic bacteria in treatment of HIV positive with a very high success. So that you have some experiences in
Yes,
this.
that's true.
Yeah? Do you have experience of that?
Well, there actually have been a few studies that have come out in the last couple of years, primarily based on African research. There's a Canadian researcher, his last name is Anucam, and he's actually found that probiotic supplements can increase CD4s and improve chronic diarrhea in Africans. So there is some support coming out that goes along with what I'm saying.